Hi, everybody from real life and around the country. I get the opportunity today to just sit down with two of the guys that I respect the most. You're familiar with both of them. Sean McDowell has been here several times over the years and written so many books, and we promote those all the time here at Real Life Ministries, and we'll be just blessed to have him come back again someday. Jim Warner Wallace is somebody we're doing this series with, and Cold Case Christianity, and both of these two are big fans of each other, and I'm big fans of them, and so we get an opportunity to just kind of do a question and answer time today based on some of the questions we've gotten from the congregation.
Perfect.
So guys, here's what I want to ask you. I know we're talking about evidences and both, cosmology, science, all those things. But honestly, what I've discovered, I don't know how this hits you guys, but I really do believe that most people, common sense says there's something going on beyond what the physical can provide evidence for. Their number one issue is often, if there is a God, why do bad things happen? How do you explain that? I mean, if there's a loving God, an all-powerful God, I mean, how? And because they can't reason that in their mind, they then look back at the evidence for God with a presupposition based around this philosophical question. What are your thoughts on that?
I'll let Beauty Before Age. You go first, Sean.
It's interesting. I was having a conversation with a friend this week, and the way he framed it is he said, on one side, you have the problem of evil, in some ways challenging God. On the other side, you have all of this evidence pointing towards the existence of God. The beginning of the universe points towards a beginner, fine-tuning towards a fine-tuner, origin of life, information, and author of life, the resurrection, consciousness. There's so much information and data pointing towards the existence of God that we can't take the problem of evil and isolate it from other things we know about the world. Now, when we look at the world and things are broken, as Christians, this shouldn't surprise us, because you go right back to Genesis chapter 3, and we see, because of choices that Adam and Eve made, the entire world got messed up and things got broken. So unlike in an atheist worldview, there's no standard of objective right and wrong, so they really can't complain that there's injustice in the world in any consistent sense. As Christians, this does not take us by surprise. We're told right at the beginning of the story that the world is broken, it's messed up, sin has utterly affected human nature, and it's even affected the natural world. And that's what I think ultimately points us towards the person of Jesus, is that Jesus is the only religious figure who takes on human flesh and suffers in our place. And that's why the book of Hebrews talks about, we don't have a high priest who doesn't understand. We have one who sympathizes with us in every way, and in his life began turning the brokenness of the world, promises to come back someday in the future and make everything right. So the brokenness of the world is part of the Christian story. And by the way, in Luke 13, Jesus is asked about moral evil and about natural evil. And he points to this Tower of Siloam that fell on people, and people want to know, is it because of something they did? And Jesus basically says, when you see evil, you better repent and turn from it. So partly what I think is going on as Christians is God allows us to suffer because he wants a broken, desperate world to look at Christians, see the peace that we have, see the contentment that we have, the love we have for our neighbors, and that when things are difficult economically and health-wise, people can be drawn to the kingdom because of the way we live. And I could give tons of examples. Even people like Francis Collins, the head of the National Institute for Health, is an atheist. And he was an atheist. What started drawing him to the faith was seeing Christians who suffered and died differently. Now, a ton more can be said about this, but I think we should start by looking at the Christian story and distinctly how Jesus responds to suffering.
Yeah, let me add something that I often say about this. As an atheist, I had a problem with evil, but I can understand why you might as an atheist. But I have a hard time understanding why we as Christians might. And here's what I mean by that. I often say that my old atheist worldview was that life was a line segment. You know your geometry. A line segment starts at a point, goes for, I hope, 90 years, to another point, 90 pain-free years where you just die peacefully in your sleep. You know, ain't no big deal. That's what I was hoping for. That's how I saw life, as a line segment. Now, if I got sick with cancer at age 40 and suffered 10 years miserably and died at 50, I'd have been ticked off because I expected to get 90 pain-free. And we always measure discomfort and suffering in the context of our lifespan. Now, what if I'm wrong, though, as an atheist, about what a life is? Is life's not a line segment? According to Christian theism, life is, you know, your geometry, it's a ray. It starts at a point, and it goes through, you know, this direction, it goes through the second point, but then it goes on infinitely. That's what rays do. They start at a point, they go through a point, but then they continue indefinitely in that direction, forever. That's the Christian life. Now, look, a lot of you suffered something in your first year of life. You had a surgery to correct a heart valve, something like that. By the time you were 3, you're like, what? Don't even know anything about it. By the time you're 10, you're like, no big deal. It must have happened to me. You tell me it happened to me, but I don't even know, because you're measuring that discomfort in the course of your 10 years. Look, if the Christian worldview is correct, as you start at birth and you go through that second thing we call death, that line segment gets shorter and shorter the longer this line goes in that direction. 1,000 years into eternity, those first 90 years, 10,000 years into eternity, the first 90, 1,000,000 years into eternity, your 90-year temporal life is a millisecond. I don't care if you have 90 crummy years. It's a millisecond compared to eternity. And that's why people who get this, Christians who get this, they live differently in the suffering. That's why we should be looking to. Now, what I see is a lot of us hold to a Christian worldview, but we treat this issue of life like a line segment instead of a ray. And that difference of thinking of life as a line segment instead of a ray, that's why I often say that eternity changes everything with the problem of evil. Because in the end, it's kind of hard to look. I know that you as a child went through that surgery for a reason, that provided you some good consequence. We just don't know what we're going through in this line segment that is going to be powerful in eternity.
Well, that's really good, guys. I think the hard thing for me as well is I think most people, they were converted, which means that they had an emotional experience. They were promised that God has a wonderful plan for your life. They prayed a prayer. They were never discipled. And it's kind of like they've got that box and with all their beliefs and all their stuff in it. And they're like, hey, just throw that in.
Yeah.
And I'll just be on my way. And God's job is to bless my plans. And they weren't discipled to think about what Jesus really said about suffering, about storing up treasure in heaven for eternity, about what you can expect. If they really understood the word of God, they would know that Jesus said this life is going to have trouble. That it, but again, that it's kind of like headline Christianity. They pick a headline without reading the actual script, which oftentimes, if you read the script, it's the headline's just there to draw your attention to get you to read the whole thing, but they don't read the whole thing.
Yeah, right.
And that's what most people have for a form of Christianity. Here's an interesting question for both of you. When you look at the scope of evidence, I remember the evidence that there was a God, specifically the microbiology in that whole scope of things. Back when I was doing this, the anthropic principle wasn't really talked a lot about. It was the microbiology that they were just starting to look at what kind of mechanisms they were finding, and the design, and the DNA in particular, the amount of information, specified information, that was all big. But when it came to Christianity, the thing that really got me was the character of the witnesses, and not just the character of the actual witnesses, but that next generation of witnesses. So it was what I would call as Jim, we went through that, the bias on the jury. Do they have any bias that presupposes something before you actually look at the evidence? Did they gain anything? That was what got me. When it came to your guys' own journeys, what evidence stood out to you that was like the most powerful, that hit you the most strongly as far as that's it? And okay, that did it right there. What was it?
You know what? I'll say a couple things. For me, it was actually a combination of really understanding God's grace and being convicted of the evidence. It was both. So for me, I grew up in a Christian home. You know, my father, Josh McDowell, you've had a ton of time at the church. And I thought someone was Christian because they just hadn't read his book. I mean, how hard is it? The evidence is there. Mm-hmm. I also thought I was pretty good morally because I didn't do the big sins. I didn't drink and smoke and chew, you know, all that kind of stuff, whatever, rock and roll. And it really wasn't until I got older that God convicted my heart. And I realized, man, I am just as arrogant and self-righteous, if not more than somebody else, the older son rather than the younger son. And that was pivotal for me. So when I see a lot of people leaving the church, a lot of times it's not a lack of evidence, although sometimes it is. I think it's a lack of ever knowing and experiencing grace firsthand. So that was a half of the puzzle for me. I think the other half was really a cumulative case, stepping back and going, oh my goodness, from the beginning of the universe, from the fine tuning, from the origin of consciousness, from the origin of life, from the existence of personal beings, from the historical Jesus, there's this weight of evidence. Naturalism can't explain any of it. Theism can, and more so Christianity. So the willingness of the apostles to die convinced me that at least they sincerely believe that. But you start coupling that with all of the other scientific and philosophical and historical evidence, and it just seems to me that Christianity makes the best sense of the world as a whole.
Yeah, I had a part. First of all, I cannot believe that Sean threw in rock and roll as one of the big set. I feel like I should get my guitar right now and just bang out a Van Halen.
That's the way it was worded.
Oh my gosh. I mean, I'm not a pagan. I guess I'm a pagan. You know, we were listening to Spotify last week and just looking at all the 80s rock bands and like the Cars. Ever listen to the Cars?
They're one of my favorite. Journey is the best band in history.
I say the same thing. It's Neil Sean, the guitarist. I can't believe that according to Sean McDowell, is sin. Okay, but
I know.
Anyway, the point is, no, I'm only kidding. But I agree with Sean in terms of his talking about cumulative cases. I've had cases where a partner. I always have a partner working cold cases. I've had 3 different partners doing that over the years. And I remember one partner was so sure of this guy killed his wife that he brought me the case. And he was like, look at this. Look at this thing here. How can this guy be innocent if this happened? And I'm like, I'm not convinced. I just learned over the years that in the end, any one thing can demonstrate any one thing. I'm a cumulative case guy. I'm like, it's just too thin. Also, I fear when I look at those kinds of cases, you can never make that case in front of a jury with that one little thing. I can explain that 4 different ways. But as you get more pieces of evidence that either require an additional explanation for each piece or fit the one explanation you're offering, you can have more confidence. You have a good conclusion. So if I had 40 pieces of evidence and he actually is the best explanation for all of them, the suspect, well, then I'm feeling pretty good about this. I'm just never comfortable when I've got one big thing. Now, then, by the way, what's the defense going to go after? Your one big thing, and they're done. No, I want a cumulative case. And so that was my mindset before I ever started looking at Christianity. I knew that in the end, this was not going to be a quick decision. This was going to be something that was going to take, if I wanted to have the peace because my skeptical nature is everyone's a liar until I prove otherwise. And I just thought, okay, Christianity is another lie, another set of liars until I prove otherwise. And so it was a cumulative case thing. I will tell you this, when we interview juries after the fact and we ask them, hey, what was the one thing? I'm always shocked at what they pick out of that huge set of evidences. One will pick one thing, one will pick another. There's never one thing. And depending on who you are, that's why we spend so much time doing such a robust case, because we know in those 12 jurors, there might be 12 different things that are meaningful to them. So I'm going to show you all 12. And I'm not sure what's going to be powerful, but that's just me. But having that background, that's why I would never allow myself to be persuaded by one thing.
Yeah, that's good. When you guys are talking with, I know you guys go to colleges, you do all kinds of different sorts of debates. You do.
Sean does the debates, dude. Sean is a debate guy.
He likes
I
those.
am not. I need to do more. But I'll do universities Q&As. Those are fun. I enjoy doing those. I'm just not a debate guy.
But my problem is that, I'm an old wrestler, an old fighter, and I'm intense, and some people think I'm being angry, but I'm just being intense, and then it could turn into a fist fight at any moment, and then I'm like, whoa, what are you doing? So anyway.
Well, Sean, we have been together on some of these things where, Sean, I think was I with you, Sean, on a trip to Berkeley one time when I was getting hot? This guy was twisting our kids, and I was like getting upset about it.
Wait,
maybe it was Brett
that one time you got upset, did you just say?
So I know that's probably why I'm not good in that setting, right? Like I don't have the character that Sean's always had a very gracious character. If you know Sean personally, you know that he's perfect for debates because he's never going to come off as a guy who's just the angry. I always tell Sean, I feel like I'm often the angry old man who says, "Get off my lawn" all the time.
Yeah.
And I don't want to. That's not.
I've watched Sean, and he looks so innocent. He lures you right in, and then he's like, then he just sucks you right in, and he's kind of dangerous. Remember that old Monty Python movie where there's the squirrel or the rabbit or whatever? Stay away from the rabbit. It's a cute little rabbit, and then it gets you by the throat. That's
exactly.
That's Sean. Let me just throw out some of the questions that some of the folks asked. We talked about causality, cause and effect, and when somebody says, okay, there has to have been a first cause for the universe, and you're saying, no, there doesn't, it's God, then their next question is, where did God come from?
Yeah.
And so go ahead and one of you guys take that on and explain what causality really says.
So the argument is, the cosmological argument says whatever begins to exist has a cause. The universe began to exist, therefore it needs a cause. The first premise is not everything needs a cause, but whatever begins to exist needs a cause. And that's self-evident and it's obvious. So ironically, for years, atheists used to say, well, the universe just exists and it didn't have a cause. They only started arguing that God needs a cause when the science began to conclusively point towards the universe itself having a beginning. So logically, you can ask what caused something of the kind of thing that can be caused. So you can ask what caused your shoes to exist, or this building, or this call that we're on. We can ask all those things, but it makes no sense to ask what caused God, because by definition, God is causeless. That's what it means to be God. So if you say what caused God, you're saying what caused the uncaused self-existent creator of the universe. And it's what we call in philosophy, it's a logical fallacy. It's a category mistake. It's like saying, what does the color purple smell like? Or what does the musical note C weigh? So the argument is not that everything needs a cause. The argument is if something begins to exist and all the evidence points towards the universe began to existing, then you conclude the universe comes into existence from nothing and is the one known exception to the law of causality. Or you can see there's a cause outside of the universe that's timeless, spaceless, powerful, immaterial, intelligent, and that sounds a lot like God.
Yeah, I can tell you that J.P. Moreland does a great, I've stolen his analogy and twisted it into my own purposes because there's a good reason to believe that there must be, and by the way, Sean's right. I mean, everyone, it's not like we Christians are the only ones who believe in an uncaused first cause. If you believe that this universe is the product of a multiverse generator, I suspect you think that multiverse generator has been here forever, that it is uncaused. So you believe in an uncaused first cause too. You just think it's an impersonal force of some type of multiverse generator. We believe it's a personal deity. But look, there has to be, in order for us to be alive, to have life in our being today, there must be an uncaused first cause. And I'm going to share with you what JP's illustration is. I've twisted it into my own. If I'm doing a search warrant on SWAT, and I was on SWAT for 3 years, I was always the second guy, the backup. I had a scout, I was the backup. I would carry the ram to do the hammer the door. But imagine on this day, we're at their front door, we're getting ready to ram it in, and he turns to me and says, hand me the ram. I'm like, oh, I forgot to bring it. So I turn to number 3 and I say, hey, can I borrow your RAM? He says, well, yes, you can, but I didn't bring it. So I'll have to borrow it from number 4. And he turns to number 4 and he says, can I borrow your RAM? And he doesn't have a RAM either. You get it? And he keeps on doing this down the line of officers. Tell you what, the problem we have here is that we have borrowing lenders in the line. They don't own a RAM. They don't have a RAM. And if we don't have somebody who is an owning lender, then we're not going to get this door knocked down. Somebody in that line has to be the possessor of the RAM to give it to the next person in the line. That's why, if the thing you're giving is life, not a RAM, at some point there has to be a possessing lender of life that has the life he can push forward causality, right? And so we know there's good philosophical reason to believe that there ought to be an uncaused cause who is the possessing, owning lender of life that we actually get life from. And that makes sense philosophically. The only question is, this is an impersonal force or a personal deity? And in the end, the other attributes of the universe, the fact that we have consciousness, that we see information in DNA, inclines me to believe we have an intelligent, personal, moral first cause. And that pushes me toward theism.
That's good. Let me ask you, here's another kind of funny question I got. What are your thoughts on, this is going to catch you from kind of, because again, it's interesting that this came in. What are your beliefs about the Shroud of Turin?
You know what? I'll tell you what I think. I teach a full class on the resurrection, and for the life of me, I can't get myself that interested in studying or caring about the shroud. I don't know why. You think I would. At best, it would prove that Jesus existed and was crucified, but nobody questions that. So the experts on this, people like Gary Habermas, who've studied over and over again, I've heard him say on a good day, he's 80 or 90% confident that it's true. So I'm taking that on his word. But even if it's true, it doesn't tell us Jesus is God, doesn't tell us the Bible's true, doesn't tell us a whole lot of things that when it's all said and done really matter. So I think it's interesting, but evidentially I just haven't been convinced that it's actually that helpful unless I'm missing something.
Yeah, I'm the same. Now, Gary's a good friend, and we've talked about this. I love Gary. He's been such a blessing to me, even on writing my own books. I'm in the middle of writing another book right now, and I have been back and forth with Gary on several issues. He's great. And he is one of the people who has looked at this more than I have. But here's what I do know. And I've looked at it enough to know I would never use it in court. And here's what I mean by that. When I do a case and I've got 35 pieces of evidence and 32 are solid and can only be interpreted really reasonably in my direction. 3, though, I think work for my case, but I could see that the defense could also kind of make those 3 work for their case. I'm not using those 3. I'm not even going to bring them up. I'm only going to go to the 32 that are best and most reasonably. Now, look, it's fair. If they want to bring them up, great. Then I will show the jury how that also helps our case. That's not a problem if they want to bring it up. But I would never bring up a piece of evidence that can be interpreted one way or the other, because I think it makes your case seem weaker. And so I only stick with the things that I know are slam dunks, right? And if he wants to bring it up, it certainly is his right. And if he does, I can show how even that thing that he thought was so strong actually works for us better. But I'm not going to bring it up and have him say, oh, that thing that they brought up works for us too. I'm not going to do it. And that's where I think the shroud is. I think the shroud has been tested any number of ways. And I've read articles where I can see why people are skeptical. And I've read articles where I can see why Christians are hopeful. But because I can see it from both sides, it's out of my case.
Yeah, I've always wondered, because again, I'm kind of in Sean's camp. What it proves, we already have proof for. So I don't necessarily understand why that matters so much.
Well, I'll tell you why it matters so much. It matters because you have 2 kinds of indirect evidence, right? You have indirect evidence that stuff that people said happened in a case, and then you have physical indirect evidence. You have non-physical indirect evidence and physical indirect evidence, and everything else we would bring into this case would be non-physical indirect evidence. This would be the first piece. Well, archaeology could categorize as physical indirect evidence, but this would be something that really connects to Jesus personally, right? That is physical. It can be seen and touched and held. It's not a principle that has to be thought about, like are the witnesses reliable? That's about making a case intellectually of it on the principles. This is actually a thing you could actually see. So in the sense that that would really be a different kind, and what I've discovered in front of juries is that if you've got these two kinds of indirect evidence, if you've got an object I can hold up and say, here's the dude's phone, it's right here, and I can show you right now, this is the text he sent. Oh, that feels good. That feels like a piece of evidence I would rather have in a jury trial than just a concept that I have to kind of argue. And that's why I think it has great value if it was true. The problem I have is that every time we test this, 6 times out of 10, you get a negative result in terms of, is the carbon dating right? Is the dating of every single swath of the cloth the same? I mean, it's just, it's all over the map. I'm not as convinced as others are that it's got any value, really.
Let me ask you a question about radiocarbon dating, radiometric dating, the age of the Earth. Jim and I were talking about the fact that the evidence from a scientific perspective, the Big Bang says that the universe came from nothing. The age issue and how you read the first chapters of Genesis make it an argument for believers. And we were talking about how we don't see it as a issue worth arguing about, because you've got the literalists who say God created the earth in 6 literal days. Is he capable of doing that? Absolutely. You've got those who say, yes, he is capable of doing that, but a day is as 1,000 years to the Lord. So could he have done it over time using directed macroevolutionary processes? In other words, he is creating life in that form, but he did it over a vast period of time. My issue with that would be there isn't evidence for macroevolution, so why co-opt that into the argument? But you got Christians that are kind of fighting over this issue, and I just don't see the need to fight about that. What are your thoughts on that issue?
Yeah, in the updated evidence that demands a verdict, my dad and I put, I think it was 9 or 10 different ways that Christians who believe the Bible's true, Adam was historical, all the essentials differ over how they interpret the book of Genesis. So this is not an unimportant question because it has implications for the intersection of science and faith. It's important, but it's not a central issue that Christians should divide over. I mean, going back to Augustine and Clement of Alexandria, you have a history within the church of a range of views being taken to interpreting Genesis. So as an apologist, basically, I want to say, how many barriers can I just get out of the way? As long as we believe the Bible's true, God is the creator. Now, if God used some kind of evolutionary process, fine. When it's all said and done, my biggest problem is with this naturalistic, purposeless, unguided explanation that tries to account for everything without there being any intelligence or guidance in mind. That's where I stop and go, whoa, 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 that is time out. And I think the evidence is lacking for that. So given the issues we have to face in culture today, I think we should talk about this. I mean, Sunday night, I just had a discussion with 2 leading scientists on my YouTube channel on the question of the historical Adam. There's a ton of discussion right now in the science and theological world about this. It's a hot theological issue, but there's a lot of space for Christians to disagree and still make sense of the scientific data as we have it. So let's talk about this, let's explore it, but let's be charitable with one another and keep our eyes focused when it's all said and done on what matters most.
Yeah, I agree. I think part of it is, look, I get it. And another good book on this is John Lennox's 7 Days That Divide the World. And I get it. There is some huge controversy in the sense that there are people who don't think this is an issue of this, well, we can disagree about the age of it. They think of it more as, well, you don't believe in the inerrancy of God's word. You don't believe in the reliability of the Old Testament document if you don't read it the way that I read it. And I get that. But what's interesting to me is that there has always been in the history of Christianity some disagreement about this. This is not a homogenous group. You can say one of these views may have been more prevalent than others. Fine, I get it. But I don't think many of us are willing to say, well, then Augustine's not a Christian, or then Clement of Alexandria is not a Christian. There is no creed of Christendom in which the age of the earth is a fundamental core belief that has to be uttered by everyone. And I think we talked about this a little bit too, Jim, this idea that I've had cases where I could tell you, I know, for example, how that he killed her. Like, and I've got him out here. I had a case, this guy's just getting paroled right now, as a matter of fact. He killed his wife in 1981 and he got rid of her body. And I cannot tell you, I could not tell you at the trial how he did it. I don't know how he did it. I didn't know how he did it. I didn't know what he did with her body. There was no body missing. I didn't know how he moved her car. I couldn't answer several key issues. We still made the case that he killed his wife. And it wasn't until after we made the case that he confessed to how he did it. Once he was convicted, he confessed. Now, interestingly, we tell jurors all the time that I can demonstrate that he did it, even though I've got a view in my head, which I'm not going to share with you, and my partner's got a view in his head, which he's not going to share with you, and the DA, he's got a view in his head. And it turns out when this guy finally confessed, all three of us were flat out wrong. Now, in the end, what matters more than how he did it is that he did it. And we can make a case for that. So the same thing's happening here. Do I know exactly how God? No. Do I know that he did it? Yes. Now, like the suspect, at some point, he'll tell me where I was right in my theories and where I was wrong. And I suspect all of us who hold these different views are going to have some things in common we got right and some things we got wrong. That's just the nature of it. I'm not the suspect. I don't think like that guy. So I'm always going to be a little bit wrong when he finally tells me how he did it. I'm also not God. And I think a lot less like God than I think like the suspect. So if I'm going to get that dude wrong, I'm surely going to get this dude wrong. So I know in the end that he did it is more important than how he did it.
Well, and back to the inerrancy of Scripture, because I think all three of us agree we believe in the inerrancy of Scripture.
Right.
But again, there are genres of Scripture. One of the rules for interpretation is what was intended by the author. Was he giving an analogy, a part analogy, a parable? Was he giving a literal step-by-step historical commentary? What was he doing? What was he intending? And I think the intention of Genesis is to say God created the earth, and how specifically he did it. I'm not sure our finite minds can fathom the power, the intellect, the way in which he spoke it into existence. But what does that? As you start to punch down, we can only go so far with that and really understand it. His ways are not our ways, and so.
But I'll be honest, Jim, I'm more than willing to accept my brothers who hold a different view than I do. So if you ask me, do you believe this? I'll probably say, well, yeah, I don't know why not. But again, I hold those views with an open hand because I know that God can easily spank that stuff out of my hand, and he probably will. Mm-hmm. So I try to hold it with an open hand. And that's why if a student asks me, what is your view on the age of the earth? I'll tell them the same thing I just told you. And I'll tell them, I'm not going to tell you what my view is. I want you to investigate that for yourself and have the comfort to know that if you land in this spectrum of historic Christian belief, you're still my brother. Don't worry. But I want you, I'm not going to be the one to guide you to any one of those. I instead want you to find that for yourself and have the knowledge to know that wherever you fall on that scale, you're still in the family.
Yeah, that is right now in a world that's coming against Christians on all, I've been on many missions trips and you'll be sitting with a missionary from India, right? You're driving down the road and you'll go, hey, what's this church over here? And he'll tell you about this church and it's not his church. And I go, what do you know, you guys? Oh, those guys are wonderful. Those guys are great. Right? Then you go to a different church. What about this church over here? Oh, the Methodists, they are amazing. They just serve the Lord. And so I go, yeah, but you're not a Methodist. You're right, but they do a great job, right? And then what you find out is these differences that separated these churches kind of went away when they're the only ones in the culture that aren't trying to kill you.
Yeah, right.
And again, there's limits to that. If it's a cult, if it's if they're promoting sexual sin, but you find out that a lot of these churches around the country, or around the world, excuse me, are not giving in. They don't look the same over there as they do over here in this culture.
Well, it's a good point, though. I think when we get comfortable, we have a tendency to navel gaze, and we start to notice what's in our navel. If you're busy, you don't know what's in there because you're not paying attention to that.
Yeah.
And I think that's an important part of what we're doing here. Look, I always say it this way. When I get a call to a shots fired, officer down, I throw on the red lights and siren. I'm doing code 3 now. And by the way, I'm going to drive right by a lot of misdemeanors that I'm not stopping for, and a lot of felonies, to be honest, that could happen right there. I'm not stopping for those either. I got shots fired, an officer is down. I'm going to drive by a lot of lesser crimes. And we are in a shots fired culture right now where the gospel is needed.
Such a good example.
I am not going to stop for misdemeanors and infractions. I'm heading shots fired. I'm responding with the lights and siren. And I think that's what we have to, what you're seeing in those countries is that the church as a whole, the big C, is responding to a shots fired culture where they're being persecuted. And so what happens is they're not going to spend a lot of time on misdemeanors and infractions at this point. They have to survive. And so a lot of it for us, I think the spiritual health of Americans is at stake because there are a lot of non-Christians that need the gospel. And so my thinking on it is I'm not spending a lot of time interacting anymore that is not an opportunity to share the gospel. That's going to be the most important thing we do.
Yeah, and there are limits to that. There are things that I think are flat out heresy, undermining of the inerrancy of Scripture as it was intended. And I'm going to be very careful about that. But, you know, Christianity has argued with each other about, you know, they're so exhausted from arguing with one another, they have no time or energy to go to their next door neighbor who has cancer and find out if they need a meal. Because I'm so exhausted. You know, from what? From battles against your own people.
Well, this is why we all need 48 hours a week with no Twitter, okay? Because the reality of it is that if you are on social media, if you're paying attention to what other people are saying about either you or the church, it's exhausting. And what it does for me is it starts to take my eyes off of what really matters. And because again, I only have a finite amount of headspace and calendar space to do all the things I want to do. And I guess as I get older, Jim, I'm more sensitive to it. You know, you look forward when you're young, and then as you get toward this age, you start thinking, well, how much of this do I have left? I think to myself, how many birthdays do I have left to call my dad? Okay, that's probably on one hand. And I'm more sensitive to how I use each one of these now than I ever was. Before, some of those I could miss, you know, and it wouldn't have bothered me so much. Now I can't miss a one. And so maybe it's because of the stage of life I'm at. I realize that all of our opportunities to engage the world in a world that's so polarized, I will no longer be involved. I will no longer be a nail for someone's hammer. And that's what we're basically doing. We got to be careful not to do that because it's so much more important. If nothing else, if I knew that my kids are grown, but if I felt like there's not another thing I need to do for my own children or for my own marriage, then maybe I would have time for that. But I think most of us know if we're raising Christian children, that we probably, if we're honest, we'd say, yeah, I probably could have spent a little more time on that, or I probably could have given a little more energy to that. And until I can no longer say that, I'm not going to give energy to these other things. Does that make sense?
Let me ask you this question, because I know I only have you guys for so long and I value it so much, but yeah. I'm actually just really interested to hear much of what you're saying. When it comes to one other thing we didn't really talk about a lot in the series that we just currently did, Jim, is, but for both of you, prophecy. What place does prophecy play in your verification of who you think Jesus is, the Son of the living God, the Messiah? Did prophecy play a big part in your perspective on Jesus?
I'll answer this for me. I would actually say prophecy played a smaller role for me. I've asked my dad what arguments played, and it was the deaths of the apostles, and it was some of the specific prophecies and the mathematical improbabilities was huge for him. For me, it was less so. I think prophecy is one significant argument, but sometimes we present prophecy in a one-to-one manner where, given the mindset of the Old Testament, it wasn't as black and white as sometimes it's taken. So I think there were some prophecies pointing forward that were distinctly fulfilled, but I think there's a lot after Jesus comes and resurrects that says, now look back at the Old Testament, you can see that it's fulfilled in me. that actually makes a lot more sense looking back. So I think it's a piece of evidence, but to me, it's not one of the primary ones that I point to.
Yeah, I think we couldn't be more on the same page on this issue. I would say I'm even going to be more controversial though and say zero, none. I never bought it for a second. And I'll tell you why, Jim. I think it is a powerful piece of if you put it cumulatively. But here's what I see us doing as Christians all the time. We make no distinction between the two forms that Sean just said. I talk about this in terms of crime scenes. There are things in my crime scene that will tell me who the suspect is in advance. If he drops, for example, his ID at the crime scene, well, guess what? That is going to tell me before I ever meet this guy who my guy is, okay? Because it's pretty clear, right? And then I'll find a torn button. And I'm like, well, does that belong to the victim, the suspect, somebody who also was in the room? I don't know. I won't know from that button if it's actually an important piece of evidence until after I identify the suspect and I see that his shirt's missing a button. Then I go, oh, dude, this now makes my case after the fact. Every crime scene has got evidence in it that makes the case prior to meeting the suspect and that makes the case only after meeting the suspect. Well, it turns out the prophecy that I see that most people throw out there, like every piece of prophecy predicts the coming of Jesus, most of it is in the second category. It's like the button. That yes, after Jesus shows up, we can compare it to Jesus and go, wow, that pretty much sounds good. But it's not like I would have read that in advance of Jesus and said, whoa, no, I wasn't, half this stuff is not even, they would argue, is talking about David, is talking about things that aren't even related to the Messiah. But after the Messiah arrives, you go, wow, that's pretty scarily similar, so it makes some sense, like the button. So I separate these two forms of evidence in a crime scene, and I don't see us doing that all that well with prophecy. But I will tell you this, the next book I'm writing, it does focus on this one line of evidence from prophecy more than I've ever done before. So I went back and read every messianic prophecy and divided them into these two categories. Then I said, let's take all the stuff that's button-like, get rid of it. We're only going to use the ID card stuff. And that's all I use to make the case. And it is still powerful. But what I notice is, then I started researching and say, well, what would today's Jewish population of religious Jews consider to be messianic prophecy? There's only a few things they would consider. And I looked at just those. What I find is interesting is why they reject the rest. You realize that the Jewish people will use prophecy from Isaiah 52 and Isaiah 54, but they'll skip over chapter 53. Well, look, if Isaiah is not somebody you can actually trust for anything, why are you using it from 52 and 54 if you won't take it out of 53? Well, 53 does seem to be most clearly talking about Jesus. So I can see why they would skip that. So I think there are some maneuvers that I see that non-believers, non-Christians, would say, yeah, I'm not going to interpret, I'm not going to take that. For example, Daniel's prophecies are very specific in terms of window of time, but it turns out the Jewish people will neglect Daniel on that issue. And even though many of these prophets are tested, when we have an informant, we ask the question, has he been right about anything else he's given us information about? If he has, he's a tested confidential informant. That's a reliable confidential informant. That's actually pretty good. Now, if you've got someone like that, we do. Isaiah predicts about history that comes true. Ezekiel, there are several prophets who predict things about history that come true. They're tested. We would call those reliable informants. Why would you not trust them for what they say about the Messiah? It's interesting that you'll see that a lot of Jewish people will trust them for the history part, but not trust them for the Messiah part. So you can kind of see how they're trying to avoid. And when you see a group trying to avoid those kinds of conclusions, it's probably because they know too that they're powerful conclusions. So as I look at it now, I think I understand how I would make the case, but back in the day when I first started, I was like, Sean, I thought these were being oversold. And I just think that most people have lumped them all together, even though only a few are ID cards and most of them are buttons.
Yeah, for me, it was, there was a couple of them that stood out that just I couldn't get around. And then, what I did was I went back and went, all right, I know that they were looking forward to the Messiah. What did they consider at that time to be messianic? And so I went back and studied that, and then I went, okay, this was what they were expecting.
Right.
And then, okay, now does Jesus meet it? But then there were some, like Isaiah 53, that just blew my mind. It's like, wow, okay. And then, I've been able to go to Israel several times and go, okay, explain to me. And, talking to some Jewish rabbis and folks, and they're like, we just don't know how to explain that. Or we're talking about, that's Israel, right? Their answers are, okay, but that doesn't make any sense if it's Israel, because Israel got beaten for their own sins. There's no, they were innocent and without, like a sheep, no, I'm sorry, guys, that just doesn't work. But those were really interesting discussions. But again, for me, it wasn't, I agree with you. And I tell people all the time, they want me to go through and preach Revelation. They want me to go through and preach the end times. And I'll go, okay, Jesus, they had all those prophecies, and yet they all missed it. Why? Because it was supposed to be something you saw in rear view mirror, not on it. That he did it on purpose. There was a mystery there that he wanted to reveal after the fact, not something you could catch on the front side. And if God worked that way back then, I don't think it's as easy for you to figure out whether we're at the end times now and the prophecy. I don't think it's going to be that easy for you to figure out now. I think it's going to be one of those things where afterwards we're going to go, oh. And I just see God working that way.
No, I agree. And I think if you applied those reasons why most Jewish believers would reject prophecy based on, they say it's the nation that's being described. If you took that same approach and you had a series of claims in modern times and you just use the same approach, oh, that's not really describing my suspect. That's, instead of saying the Messiah, call it your suspect, you'd see how silly some of these approaches actually sound. So I think you're right. But I wanted the strongest set of evidences that cannot be interpreted one of two ways, kind of like the shroud. And that's why a lot of prophecy I felt like could be interpreted one of two ways. So, okay, let's just get rid of it for sake of argument, for the strengthening of our case. It's not like we needed that really to make a case for the, I came to believe in the resurrection without ever looking and giving much weight to prophecy. So I get why some people do, but that was just not my story either.
Well, guys, I know you guys had to go at 4. And I hope we get to do this again. I could ask you questions all day long. Thank you for your investment in our church. Thank you for the investment in our kids and our young people. And you guys have no idea how much we love and respect you. And thank you for being on that front line for us.
Thanks for having us.
At our church here, and I know around the country, but our church here, you're brothers. And we support you. We love you. And we'll hopefully see you both sometime.
Well, I'm just thinking, we'll hope we'll see each other in the kingdom of heaven. But I thought you were going to say that. I'm like, really? After all that, you hope?
No,
you didn't say that.
No,
so
I know we'll see you then. I'm talking about having you and your wife here
we'll be there.
now.
Yeah, of course.
We'll do it when things settle for sure. Would love to come back. Thank you, Jim.
God bless you guys.
Blessings, guys.